How American history should be taught is a contentious topic once again. Many Republican officials have decried an academic approach called critical race theory that makes race and racism central to exploring U.S. history, laws, and institutions. There are movements in several states that would seek to mandate how U.S. racial history can be discussed in the classroom. Our next guest is an historian with some thoughts about all this. Julian Hayter is a professor at the University of Richmond. Professor, thanks for being back with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Critical race theory has been around since about the 1970s. What do you make of this current debate?
I think in many ways it's being used as a straw man, right, by political forces that don't want to reconcile over our tortured racial history and the teaching of our tortured racial history. But even more importantly, how that history helps define many of the incidents that gave rise to the current racial reckoning. And I think it's interesting that critical race theory is being brought up at this moment while this country is relitigating some of the darker chapters of its racial history in the current context.
Mm-hmm. Of course, President Biden spoke this week in Tulsa and talked about how white mobs had murdered hundreds of black Americans and destroyed thousands of homes.
Right.
And he pointed out that this event had been barely acknowledged for decades. It does not stand alone, does it?
No, I think what we've seen in the telling of American history for most of the 20th century is that certain people's history had been erased. If you look at a history textbook from the mid-20th century, you'd be hard-pressed to find people of color, women, and even poor white folks, for that matter. And when you see these folks in these texts, they're almost always portrayed as inconsequential or dehumanized figures. So the Tulsa incident isn't a one-off. The burying of this history is more in keeping with the ways that American history was told throughout the 20th century than otherwise, in large part because in some ways, the teaching of American history up until recently was about heritage as much as it was about history.
Do you think a lot of Americans view history as a discipline with fixed facts, something like algebra or geometry, when in fact it's not that at all?
Right. And I think in education or the teaching of history, we've moved away from heritage toward history. And many people don't know the difference, right? History is an attempt to reconstruct and interpret actual events and lived experiences. It follows rules of evidence and is peer reviewed and debated. I think what a lot of Americans understand is heritage, which is a romanticized version of the past, usually devoid of the darker chapters.